Chapter 4. They slept late the next morning and were awakened by the roar of a racing motorboat as it headed down the river to the bay. They were all, even Sammy, shoved out of sleep into the hot morning like falling out of bed. Dicey raised her face from the poncho. Her cheek was damp with sweat. Her things stuck to the rubber. She rubbed at her eyes. The woods rested behind them. The water and the opposite shore lay before them. Between these wandered the narrow river. The sun was high in the sky, high and hot. They all peed in the woods and then gathered fuel for a small fire. Dicey pulled the 5 fish out of the water. With the jackknife she gutted them and scraped off some of their scales. Then she and James threaded them onto supple branches. Nobody spoke. They ate the fish and finished the milk and bread. James experimented with toasting the bread on a stick. He got a patchwork piece of toast, splotches of white, splotches of black, and various shades of brown. Dicey gathered the underwear, almost dry, from the bushes where it had been hanging all night. James taught Sammy how to put out a fire properly, how to cover it with dirt, and then stamp on it and wait, to be sure no telltale smoke rose from the ashes. Maybeth helped Dicey fold up the ponchos and pack them into her bag. They gathered all their garbage into the brown grocery bag. Dicey knew it was time to go, but she didn't want to start, not yet. She pulled out her map and studied it. They would go through Easton and then loop west. Dicey would have preferred to stick to the water's edge, to follow the shoreline down, but this countryside had too many fists and fingers of land that reached out into the water. If they followed the shoreline, they would travel many miles more than they had to, winding in and out along the points of land. At the sound of another motor, they all froze. A small boat, really just a rowboat with an outboard, chugged down river. 3 boys were in it, all about James's age. They were tanned by the sun, all wore cut-offs, t-shirts and sneakers. Their hair looked shaggy, as if it hadn't been cut all summer. They trailed lazy hands in the water as they moved slowly, aimlessly, down the river and out of sight. "You know," Dicey said, "they look like us, don't they, James?" He nodded. He followed the wake the little boat left behind. "Do you think we're like most of the kids over here, in the way we look?" Dicey asked. "Natural camouflage," James said. Dicey looked at them. They were all tan, and her day in the sun yesterday had caught her up in brownness for what she'd lost during hours inside at Bridgeport. Their hair was scruffy and Maybeth's curls looked tangled. But they didn't look out of place or unusual. They looked like kids running a little wild during the summer. They returned to the road, hurrying down the dirt driveway. James carried the bag of trash and dumped it into a garbage can near the little store Dicey had shopped in the afternoon before. The clock within the store read 10, late. The children walked on beside the highway. This was Route 33, heading east. In Easton, they would change roads to go south. Traffic was light on this hot summer morning. They walked 2 by 2 on the shoulder of the road. Fields of corn hedged them in. Insects buzzed among the rows. Dicey wondered if they could take a few ears for supper. Her pan wasn't big enough to hold a whole ear of corn, but you could scrape off the kernels. Her curiosity was aroused by these fields, so unprotected from the road. Anybody could go in and steal the corn. There were no fences to stop them. Maybe that was why she didn't want to do it. As they neared the town of Easton, they began to pass shopping centres and development houses, little low 1-storey ranches with sprigs of new grass and 1 or 2 puny trees. At one of the large markets, Dicey bought a pie on sale and 4 bananas. They cost 92 cents. She told her family that they would stop to eat after they had passed through Easton. Sammy wanted to stop before the town. Takes all day to get through a place. "Not a little one like this," Dicey said. "Are you sure?" "Pretty sure," Dicey said. "Want a bet?" They wagered an hour's fishing time. If it took too long to get through Easton, Dicey would have to fish for an hour while Sammy had free time. If it didn't, then Sammy would have to fish an extra hour. Sammy liked this. Either way, he won. He walked eagerly on. Dicey won the wager, of course. As she said to herself, if she couldn't read a map by now, she'd be a pretty sore fool. The streets of Easton, even the main arteries that they walked on, were sleepy, tree-lined roads. The tallest building reached only 4 stories. Stop signs outnumbered traffic lights. Their roads took them around the town rather than through its centre. They passed by a long pond that ran behind the YMCA and then down across abandoned railroad tracks to where a big highway joined up with 322. Here, Dicey took out her map again. Route 50, a 4-lane highway with a grass divider. Trucks, cars, campers, buses, vans, pickups, motorcycles, all thundered down the highway, hard on one another's heels, travelling fast. Dicey wanted to get off this road for 2 reasons. First, it was too heavily travelled and the air was thick with fumes and noise. Second, Route 50 went due south to Cambridge before bearing east to Salisbury. It would be quicker to take a road that followed the third side of the triangle formed by Easton, Cambridge and Salisbury. A river lay across that route, the Choptank. It was broad down by Cambridge, but narrower up above, and would be easy to cross, she guessed, remembering the little river they'd camped by. She decided to turn off the main highway and cut cross-country. A quarter of a mile south of Easton, she took a turn onto River Road. That had the right sound to it. They crossed the highway at a run. They raced across the southbound lanes, then had to wait several minutes before they could dash safely across the northbound traffic. Dicey saw fields ahead and a few houses. 20 yards from the highway, they were back in open countryside. It was James who sighted the circus ahead, set up on a fallow field. He saw the Ferris wheel. "Let's go there and eat," he said. "We can't spend any money," Dicey said. "That's okay, I like to look," James answered. They ate the bananas as they approached the circus. They came to it from the rear, from behind a big tent. A short midway with a Ferris wheel and a carousel and a dozen booths for games and food stands led away from the tent entrance. People were hurrying around, setting up games, carrying boxes marked with the names of soft drinks. A man tinkered with the engine that drove the Ferris wheel. Dicey stopped by a trash can. She broke the pie into 4 pieces and handed them out. They dropped their garbage into the metal barrel and stared for a while at the activity on the midway and then drifted back to the tent from which music and voices issued. "Do you think they'll have elephants?" Sammy asked Dicey. "It doesn't look big enough," she said. "I don't see any place where they'd keep animals. Do you, James? Doesn't look like much of a circus." James peered into the tent, standing in the doorway. "There's a tightrope," he reported. "Out!" ordered a sharp voice from the dimness within the tent. The Tillermans backed away. "You heard me." A woman stepped out into the hot sunlight. She had bright red hair and wore a man's shirt over tight blue jeans. She wore sandals with very high heels and carried a whip. 3 terriers, like little white mobilised mops, swirled around her feet in eager circles. Somehow she managed not to step on them or even trip over them. "What are you kids doing here?" she demanded. She sounded angry at them. "Nothing," Dicey said. "Tell that to the Marines," the woman said. "You know we don't open till 6. "No, we didn't," Dicey said. "You do now," she answered. She put her hands on her hips and glared at them. The whip dangled down, and one of the little dogs, the one with a pink ribbon on its head, jumped up to grab it out of her hand. The woman rocked on her heels and the dogs ran off in a row, the other 2 chasing the one carrying the whip. Dicey started to smile. "You heard me," the woman said, "or should I call the police?" "I don't think so." A slow, thick man's voice spoke from behind the Tillermans. Dicey turned to face this new person. He was a tall black man with eyes so dark brown they looked almost black beneath thick eyebrows. He was clothed entirely in black, a black shirt and black pants and high black leather boots. His tightly curling hair was cut short, and he had a narrow short beard along his jawline. His face looked relaxed, as if nothing could upset him. Maybeth moved closer to Dicey. James stood where he was, his mouth open. Sammy was poised to run. The man spoke again. "Relax, kid, she won't hurt you. Claire, what is this?" "They were snooping around," the woman told him. "This one," she indicated Dicey. He said they didn't know we're closed until 6. You go back to work, the man told her. I'll take care of this. They waited while she whistled for the dogs and then stalked off back into the tent. We are off limits until the show opens, the man told the Tillermans. We really didn't know, Darcy said. Then you're strangers around here. His eyes studied her. Darcy nodded. Looking at his calm face with its studying eyes, she said what she was thinking. Strangers about everywhere. He looked quizzically at her. She had no cause to be angry, Darcy said. He nodded. I apologise for that. Claire's got a bad temper, but that's no excuse. Believe it or not, she's a good friend, a good person to have on your side. We owe you an apology too, Darcy answered. Even if we didn't mean to, we did trespass. I'll see you out, he said. You came through the back? Where are you going if you don't live in Easton? South, Darcy said. Where are you from? North. The man stopped 2 strides ahead of them and turned to look at them all. His leather boots creaked a little. The Tillermans stood in a row facing him. Are you okay? He asked. Yeah, Darcy said. You're not a boy, the man said, walking beside them now. He had a little smile hovering around his mouth. No, I'm not, Darcy agreed. Do you own this circus? James asked. Yep, he said. Why? James asked. It's my living. Name's Will, by the way. I like moving around, following the good weather. I wouldn't think you'd make any money, James observed. Why not? Will asked. It's so small. That's right enough, Will agreed. Still, his warm voice drifted off without finishing the sentence. At the road he said goodbye. Good travelling, he said to Darcy. Thanks for rescuing us, Darcy said. You didn't need help, he answered. Take care. You too, Darcy said. Oh, I do, you can believe I do, he said. He turned back with a wave. The Tillermans walked away. They were silent for a long time, each thinking his own thoughts in the steamy afternoon. The road wound through farm country, and here the farms were large. Several fields separated one farmhouse from another. The fields were flat. The farmhouses had only a few trees near them. Big barns and many sheds lay behind the houses. They were prosperous farms, you could tell, because the barns gleamed with fresh red paint, and the houses often had swimming pools out front. Finally, James broke the silence. She probably figured she could be angry and mean to us and get away with it, he said, because we're kids. She didn't get away with it, Darcy reminded him. Sammy, you were ready to run, weren't you? I didn't know what she'd do, Sammy explained. She said she'd call the police. That was smart, Darcy said. But, James started to say, and then he stopped. They walked on and sang as they walked. They passed fields and more fields. Some of them had been picked bare. Some of the farms had a cardboard sign posted at their mailboxes. Pickers wanted. At a crossroads, Darcy went into a general store and bought potatoes and tomatoes, a quart of milk and another loaf of bread. She also bought 2 Cokes in cans because she was thirsty. All these cost $2.35. Except for the $40 she didn't want to spend, she was almost out of money. They shared the Cokes. We could pick for a day or two, Darcy said to her family, and get some money. Do we need money? James asked. Of course, Darcy said. I've got some set aside in case we have to go back to Bridgeport. I don't want to spend that. So we're not out of money, but we need more. Would they hire kids? James asked. We could try, Darcy said. Are you game to try? Could you pick for a day, Sammy? Sure, Sammy said. Darcy grinned at him. I believe you could, she said. I'll try, Maybeth volunteered. I guess so, James said. Not today, though, Darcy said. Today there's a creek up a ways or down a ways. I thought we'd camp by that and fish. Somebody has a couple of fishing hours owed us. I will not say who. It's me, Sammy cried, because I lost the bet. It's me. As they approached the creek Darcy had seen on the map, only the map called it a river, the land developed a few gentle rises. These were not hills like they'd found in Connecticut, not high, sharp hills. They were gentle roundings, mere ripples in the land. In contrast to the flat land all around, however, they stood up. Here there were hardwood trees, sycamores and maples and oaks, as well as the pines that grew everywhere. The road went over the little creek, and the Tillermans turned off the road, following the creek's dry banks, until they judged they were far enough from road and farmhouse. Sammy dug a few worms and set himself to fishing. James and Dicey gathered wood for a fire. Maybeth spread out the ponchos under the green trees as best she could. There wasn't room for more than 2 of them because of the roots and bushes and the creek bank. When everything was ready and they had only to wait for Sammy to catch something, Dicey and James and Maybeth went downstream to wade and wash. Sammy watched them go without a word. He stood very quiet in the centre of the narrow creek, letting the water splash at his hips, holding the fishing line out from his hands. The late afternoon wore away into early evening. Dicey came back and started the fire. Sammy had caught nothing and reported no nibbles. He was not quite ready to quit trying, he said. Dicey shoved the potatoes into the fire. The skins would burn maybe, but she didn't think she could get a pot of water boiling on the small fire she felt safe building. They ate potatoes, tomatoes and bread for supper and passed around the carton of milk. There was enough food to fill them, and they kept back some bread and milk for breakfast. James put out the fire using dirt, not water, because water would make more smoke. The sun was going down then. It grasped at the land with long yellow fingers and made the mottled trunks of sycamores look like people's skin. Flocks of birds made their evening journeys home, twittering to one another, and far off an occasional motor sounded. "You know," Dicey said, "we don't have to go anywhere. We could always travel like this, following the warm weather, like Will said he did. We can take care of ourselves." "Yeah, but what's the point?" James asked. "There doesn't have to be a point," Dicey said, "just doing it, like sailing." "We have to go home," Maybeth said. "Home? We don't have a home," Dicey said. "I thought we were going to Mama's home," Maybeth said. "Is that our home too?" Sammy asked. "I don't know," Dicey said. "That's what we're trying to find out, I guess." "Oh, well," she said. "I guess you're right, James. I mean, you have to go to school." "So do you," he grinned at her. "So do we all. We're going to grow up. We have to." I know," she said. "If it was Mama's home, it has to be ours too," Maybeth said. "We have this grandmother there," Dicey answered, "but we can't tell what she'll think of us, what she'll want. Mama never talked about her," Dicey pointed out. "Yes, she did," Sammy said, "but it made her sad. She'd cry." "Is that right? What did she say?" "I can't remember, only the sadness." "Sorry, Dicey." "That's okay. I didn't know Mama ever said anything about her. I just don't know what to expect there." "Whatever," James said, "we can take care of ourselves, wherever." "I know an old lady who swallowed a fly," Dicey chanted. They sang all the silly songs they knew until darkness had gathered around them. Then they lay down close together and went gently to sleep.